WeAreDenver. This is IllFooMinati with your host, Ryan Foo.
That's right, I'm here. Twice the power, twice the Ryan Foo. This is IllFooMinati. I'm always happy to be here. Hello, what's up? Sorry, I should look at the camera. It's good to see you again. It's been a whole week, or maybe you've never seen me before, so hello, and thank you for letting me into your consciousness. I am here today with two human beings that are wonderful folks from Denver, Colorado. First is Bobby Lefebre. So say hello, Bobby.
What's up, everybody? Hello.
And the next is Stephen Sampson.
Hello.
Sampson hosts the next podcast, which is Nothing Explained, where he very brilliantly explains nothing with no liability or legal recourse. So.
I'm not productive, and I feel fine about it.
Good. Glad to hear that. Well, we're here today to talk about exactly where we are sitting, which is the North Side. It's been known as the North Side for a while, but now it's becoming known as something different, which is the Highlands. So Denver itself is changing, and any of you that are watching from within our city know that it's part of a big conversation that's going on right now. But everybody I talk to about it seems to have a different take on where Denver was and where Denver's heading. So that's sort of what our podcast is about today. And we're going to chat with Bobby about his new series called Welcome to the North Side, which is obviously related to this. So let's start with that.
Yeah.
Bobby, tell us about the series. What's it about?
Yeah, so the web series, I had actually written a play a few years back about what's happening in the neighborhood through the lens of a young professional who's lived in the neighborhood their entire life, who actually ended up buying a house and sort of had to contend with the neighborhood changing and sort of it becoming a different place, right? So the log line of the web series that we're working on right now is a Chicano young professional buys a house in his gentrifying neighborhood but finds himself searching for home.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So basically the web series is a comedic look at what's happening in the neighborhood, right? So it's this negotiation of space and history and place. And so we're doing sort of a short form web series format. We've released 5 episodes now. The last one we released was yesterday.
How long are they?
They range from like 2 to 10 minutes
Gotcha.
in length. I think as attention spans shrink, so does the mediums by which we consume information. So we felt that the web series was a good platform to explore this in a way that was, using, art and medium, some sort of thing that's different than conversation or just sort of this esoteric conversation that happens when we talk about what gentrification is.
Right. Which is most of the conversation that's going on, is this sort of almost existential conversation around how it's just something that's happening everywhere.
Yeah, it's interesting, man, because I've been addressing this issue for a long time in different ways, especially by utilizing art. I always consider myself an artist first. And so lately, though, I agree with you that it's this conversation that's just exploded across the city, but it's nothing that's new, right? We've been dealing with these things, especially in this neighborhood, for over a decade now.
I would say especially in this country.
Absolutely. Yeah. All over the country.
Yeah. All over the world. I would say that the idea of coming into somebody else's territory, land, and sort of conquering their sense of culture, conquering their physical space, conquering their food, their entertainment, and then profiting off of it. That's not a new concept at all.
Right. So that's also what's difficult about the conversation is the word gentrification is this big umbrella term that is just so broad that it doesn't really say anything. So when we're talking about what's actually happening, you use that word as an entry point to kind of, frame the conversation, and then you really start talking about what's happening. You talk about, economic injustice, you talk about racism, you talk about power and social and, other sorts of...
So you think it's impossible to talk about gentrification without getting into those more nuanced conversations?
Absolutely, because that's really what it is, right? It's the intersection of all of those things sort of coming together to create this monster.
Yeah. So this is sort of a backwards question then, but if you were going to define gentrification, what would you if someone was said, well, I don't really know if it's real, what is gentrification? What would you say?
I think that social scientists, when they discuss gentrification, they talk about measurable things, right? So I would give a long-winded answer. If they asked me to put it into a nutshell, it's the renovation, attention being paid to traditionally marginalized communities, the building of infrastructure, the changing of real estate, the exchange of money, for land, all of the social and political things that go along with that. But, really when we're talking about it and when people try to measure it academically to where, we can actually get somewhere and say, hey, this is actually what it looks like. Social scientists measure things like change in racial makeup of the neighborhood, change of people with college degrees moving in, change of housing prices, what is the percentage of increase or decrease there. So there's measurable things that we can look at. I'm a statistics nerd, so I do a lot of that. So when I talk about it, I actually bring some of those things up to let people know what that looks like.
So what are some statistical or metric-based changes that have happened to this neighborhood? Yeah,
so where we are right now, it has undergone crazy change over the last, decade. And so I pulled up this presentation that I did recently with some statistics. So, for example, the Latino population in this neighborhood proper went from, being 68% Latino in 2000, which is the year I graduated high school. And in 2015, with the most recent census data that we have, it's shrunk to 27%.
Wow.
Right? So that's a significant increase. Now, on the converse, the white population has went from 29% in 2000 to 66%. So almost a complete mirror flip.
Yeah.
Average household income has gone from $39,000 a year to just about $93,000 in this neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Average home sale price, $190K to about $500K.
So let me pause you there and help us understand, because I think there are a lot of folks out there, hopefully not too many of you that are listening to this podcast right now, but there are a lot of folks out there who would say, well, isn't that good that housing prices are going up and average income's going up?
Sure.
So what would be your response to that?
It goes back to the question of who does it benefit, right? And so when we're talking about, rampant development, when we're talking about, what it looks like, development in these communities all over the country, all over the world, like you mentioned, it's sort of this idea of colonization, in that, the people who are existing somewhere, who have existed somewhere, are very rarely taken into the equation when the master plans of this process are being implemented, right? So development usually happens through and around people, not with them in mind or with them. So, obviously people who own their homes have a little bit more power in a situation like this, but there are, people that rented their homes, very little power. People who had businesses for a long time that didn't own the buildings that their businesses, were in. So we're talking about, in some parts we're talking about ownership of property, which is also a difficult conversation, because you have people who are selling their homes and cashing out because they're, they bought a house for $50,000 back in the day and now it's worth $500,000. So you flip that, 5 times or whatever, and, how do you blame people for that?
Right.
But at the same time, again, research shows that people that sell their homes in these types of neighborhoods and move somewhere else actually struggle in the future maintaining that same degree of wealth. So
really,
yeah.
That's interesting. So it's not a good cash out.
It is I think it's a short-term cash out, depending on, what happens with the investment of the money or whatever, but it's...
I would suggest it has more to do with the culture of money than it really does with, when you're coming up in a lesser neighborhood, the mean intelligence with regard to the culture of money is just reduced. That's part of the whole thing. So... In a way, it's a game, So big money comes in with big money rules, and you've been small money, and you suddenly don't know what game it is you're playing. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a big situation there.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, I looked up the word gentrification. It does come from the word genteel, the idea of like higher birth and like kind of the very racist aspects of old money. I think the word is origin in French. So,
yeah.
And I was also thinking as this was coming up, I just named that whole process the crane game, because there's, count the cranes basically. You drive around anywhere in Denver and there's like 10 new things in every neighborhood going up over like 8-10 stories.
We were joking that the crane is the new official bird of Denver.
Nice.
Hashtag WeAreDenver. That's right. I'm writing that down.
Yeah. Well, there's so much development, and it's curious to me to see the history of that development. I don't know a whole lot about this neighborhood, but I did a lot of my stomping as a younger man in 5 Points, and it's been crazy to see 5 Points change.
Yep. Same shit.
Same shit.
Can we?
No, yeah, you could. This is uncensored.
Oh, good.
WeAreDenver is a place where we can be honest.
We keep it real.
Yeah. We do our best. I mean, that's why we're not on the regular radio.
Perfect.
Yeah. So one thing that's happened to me is a recognition that. So let's use some of the same statistics. 5 Points was a mecca for jazz and for the African American community in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
There was a time when 90% of all of African American people that lived in Denver lived in 5 Points. And now that number is somewhere below 10 or 15%. So you're right, there are these changes that are happening, and those people get pushed out, and those communities get destroyed, and all that ends up being left are plaques, really. You know, a couple of sort of sentimental tokens that give you a little bit of text, but that doesn't give you any sense of what the culture is.
Right.
And to me, it seems like such an odd, backwards thing, because what ends up taking its place isn't a new culture. It's this unique, cultureless, economic landscape. And it's not, maybe it's not cultureless, but it's definitely a culture of money.
Yeah.
And definitely a culture of this game that we're talking about. And just, I don't know how to talk to people who are playing that game, maybe playing it really well, and how to tell them that other forms of culture are important. You know, how do you convince people? Is art one of the ways that you go about it? And have you had conversations with people like that? And what are the
I mean,
barriers?
there's multiple ways, I think, to address these things. You know, obviously I know what the limitations of art can be. I know that art isn't going to change policy, but it will, it does have the opportunity to spark a certain curiosity and conversation with people that may, frame a topic or a situation in a different way. I think what you're saying is really interesting, especially in 5 Points. People that are there hanging out at the brewery or the bagel shop or whatever the fuck's there now, they forget that part of the reason that black people lived in that neighborhood was because that's where black people were told that they could live, right?
Legally.
Yeah. These were areas where people were relegated to, right? And so you had, as recent as the 60s, you had redlining happening where black people couldn't buy homes outside of a certain area, or people couldn't rent homes outside of a certain area.
Same thing for Japanese communities and Jewish communities and
marginalized communities everywhere. That's how it works, right? So you're going to tell us where we can live, and then when it's convenient for you, you're going to come back and take what you had, given us, right?
Well, I would say that's part of the whole master plan. If you look at 5 Points in particular, the institution of the light rail destroyed the one community center that was there. Welton was shut down for 5 or 6, 7, 8 years. It was supposed to only be 2. And as soon as that happened, of course it devastated all the local businesses if the main street that you're on gets vanquished.
Well, that's another conversation. You read a lot about how increasing the accessibility to transportation is a precursor to a lot of gentrification all over the country. Bike lanes, light rail, all this stuff that is seemingly positive, right? Has real effects to other people. So they wonder why people complain about the light rail going in, or are skeptical about bike lanes, right? Because the question goes back to who is it for, right? I don't necessarily believe that bike lanes are created for, people of color or people who don't have any other means of transportation. Bike lanes are created for the dude who dresses like he's in the Tour de France, has a boat, 2 cars, a motorcycle, and, in the garage, right? Because that's the infrastructure that we're talking about.
He expects, too. That's people who are in poor or marginalized communities don't expect the government or the system to create bike lanes for them.
And it's a necessity, right? You ride your bike because that's your mode of transportation. It's not because you're trying to be healthy or green. And
that's an interesting discussion because, I don't know, the mood and tone, I'm super pro bike for one thing. So part of me, I'm sure it's easy to imagine like a council person in their head being like, oh, bike lane, and they picture that guy that you just described. But the run out of a bike lane, I think that's amazing, everyone should be on a bike. Bike should be the form of transportation, really, because it's the most efficient form of travel ever devised. And it really is, it can uplift people, especially if you just having the culture of being like, it's okay to ride a bike. That kid who grew up thinking like, oh, I'm shit because I don't have a car or something, in a culture where it's totally okay to ride a bike, and that to be your form. You're like, hey, how you getting around? I'm on a bike. Oh, cool. Just like plain flat out.
But is that the motivation, do you think? Do you think that that's really the motivation for these things?
I don't know. But that's what I'm saying is I wonder if it's a healthy discussion because the end result is positive.
That's where I think that it gets more complicated, because there are many positive modalities, but I think there are many folks in the higher tiers. I think most of the folks who ride bike lanes aren't the folks who benefit from bike lanes on the development side of it. The folks who benefit from that are the folks who are selling buildings and the folks who are selling businesses and trading stocks and stuff like that.
I don't know if I completely agree with that, because the bike lanes take up parking spaces and parking spaces generate money. You know?
There's some of that's definitely true, but I think there's a larger goal and vision and prospect, and I think bike lanes are one very, very small example.
That's what I'm saying. I don't want to talk about bike lanes like that, because I want to be 100% pro bike lane, and I'm like,
I think that's part of how they catch us, though. Is like to be honest, here's another example, right? Parking is a big hot topic in Denver, right? Perfect. So this is something that obviously it'd be nice to have more parking, right? And on a sort of base, I don't want to use the word superficial, but on the first level of it, it does appear good that we want plenty of parking, right? But then when you see that parking structures are economically viable, like you were just saying, I think they generate something like $20,000 a parking spot per year, and you have a giant parking structure that sells, 2,000 parking spots, whatever it is.
Yeah, it has almost zero labor attached with
exactly
it.
Right.
Or anything.
Yeah, it's just a toll booth thing that maybe even is a robot, and you don't even have to pay someone to sit there.
Yeah, maybe a snow removal service, and that's it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Then the question of whether or not it's important to the individual community member to have parking, and whether or not it's important to the developer to destroy a business so that they can build a 17-floor parking structure. Those are different intentions and conversations for different people, but they still affect the whole of the community. So I think bike lanes are kind of similar. I'd imagine even like Jamba Juices and Whole Foods is a good example, right? We all want healthy food. We all want to have good access to that kind of stuff, but they, I think as Bobby was saying, tend to be a precursor to a certain kind of exploitation of community. And that's...
Well, and if you go to any, neighborhood in any, inner city where people are struggling and marginalized, if you ask them, out of these three things, what is your priority? Better schools, access to opportunity for better work, or bike lanes? Which do you think what order do you think they'll put the bike lane in? And so I think that's what we're saying is when the demographic changes and you have people who have, more social, political, and economic capital moving in, who can put their kids in whatever school they want to, who don't have to worry about where their money's coming from.
What schools are around them.
Bike lanes are hella,
makes sense.
Yeah, put the bike lane in, right? That's number one on my list. I think another thing, like Whole Foods, access to food, before these things happen, a lot of these neighborhoods are food deserts, right? You have to go outside the neighborhood to get food.
Yeah, if I could just, the Natural Grocers just opened on the corner of 38th and Brighton, which is 2 blocks from my house, which moves the closest grocery store by 1.5 miles.
That's good.
So like yesterday, and the road right next to it just got paved, and it was a total disaster. Yeah. So I live in Gentrification Central.
Yeah.
So.
And the question is, where was that 10 years ago when the people of that neighborhood didn't have a grocery store, right? So we start to see this sort of, and those of us that have been in these neighborhoods, in these communities for a long time, that suffered through that. Yeah. There's a certain resentment that we have that says, hey, wasn't our voice loud enough back then? Didn't we want access to these things? I went to see Dave Chappelle at Comedy Works when he was working out his most recent routine. One of the nights he made this joke about, he's like, they don't tell black people that we can't go to Whole Foods. He's all, but a $6 apple will. So like he's like, they don't tell you black people aren't welcome here, but a $14 bottle of water with asparagus in it will. Right. So there's these the nuances of what these things mean and what they represent and who they serve is tough.
Well, it's got historical context to it too.
Yeah.
And for me, it's not about any particular race, or it is about particular classes, and ways in which human beings can take advantage of each other. So, in my opinion, taking advantage of affluent folks wanting bike lanes, and taking advantage of people in marginalized communities wanting better schools or wanting better grocery stores, it is not any different. It's the same people at the top who don't care who they're profiting from, don't care what the mode is. They're all about the money. So that's, to me, the cornerstone of this, which is that their enemy is ultimately, well, maybe not enemy. The thing they're taking advantage of is always community. Different kinds of communities who want different kinds of things, They may or may not fight with each other. But who are those people, and are they parts of our community? The answer is always no, right? Those people may not even live in the state. They may not even live in the country. They're somewhere else making millions, billions of dollars, because those are the only people with the kind of resources to make these kind of moves.
Yeah.
So anyway,
it's a really interesting argument, and I have a very interesting perspective on it because I work for one of the main gentrifying forces in Denver. I would say probably in the top 10 or something, but I work for Exto. And
they're a property management and venue owning company.
Yeah, and the main guy who's nearing retirement, a large portion of his fortune came from owning all the land around and underneath the Coors Field. Like, not literally all of it, but he had a big chunk down there. And then he bought up what is now Exto Tracks, the Exto Event Center and Tracks, and like a square mile around that. And that's all mostly been sold off, and we have another square mile up past, up at the next light rail stop, basically. But he did it 15 years ago, and he bought a piece of crap for practically free. And any one of those buildings, of like the 10 that he owns, have paid for the single first investment that he made, you know? So,
of course.
But the interesting thing is, while they're definitely money kinds of guys in that regard, it was really interesting watching all this stuff happen in Rhino because they were like, please go to all of the community meetings and please vote the way we want you to, you know, which I was like, yeah, I'll go. And I was like, but I'll vote how I want. But I still ended up voting the way they wanted, which was like 100% unregulated pro-commerce.
Yeah.
Because they were like, they were taking lots of community input. Anybody who wanted to be there could be there and say anything they wanted. And they did like 10 of them, you know. So like there's lots of room for comment. And they were super proactive. Even the money people were super proactive about making sure that all the buildings that go in are leaning green and have ground floor activation and, you know, talking about bike lanes and plants and things, you know. So a building that's just apartments, really boring to look at and stuff, everybody was like, do not do that. And there's a commission of art that grew up with the neighborhood, and they're doing a pretty good job of making sure that people are at least thinking about it.
I think this. So I was having a conversation with a gentleman named Benzel the other day, who is one of the movers and shakers in 5 Points, and he was talking about how, you know, folks may not be a fan of Albus Brooks, or folks may not be a fan of other, just regular politicians who are doing their best to, so on and so forth. But if the community, and it's a double-edged sword, so be wary of what I'm about to say, but if the community can't show up and make its voice heard in certain spaces where the idea is to have people's voices heard, then the people who have opened those forums are just going to do whatever they want. Now, it's both sides of it, because I'll tell you, I've been to 3 or 4 of those Rhino meetings now, and they are on a Tuesday at 3:30 p.m., which pretty much no working person could ever make. And everyone who's there is somebody who owns a business, has capital invested, is a creative that is muraling on the walls. And there's little bits of space for people to have their voices really heard. But what tends to happen, and this is just in my experience, and I'm a young 25-year-old man, but a couple of times that I've seen it is they take the input, they say, all right, cool, that's a good idea. We should be weary of putting giant properties next to residential areas because it inflates the value of homes, basic things like that. And then they do it anyway, because they can take your input and then just decide, well, we got other input as well, and we decided to go with that one.
Well, and I also think it's a structural issue in that if you look at all of the registered neighborhood organizations around this city, they're not representative of the communities that they serve. So I can tell you all of the ones in North Denver, besides maybe there's a new one that has sort of surfaced. They're mostly white. They're mostly of the same sort of thought, process, background. And so, yeah, you can have 15 meetings. And if you have the same people that are charged with speaking for an entire neighborhood, making a recommendation, there's no variance of opinion there. And so, I joined an RNO for a very brief period of time and was just disillusioned by the way that they operated. They weren't. I really don't believe that they were interested in hearing perspectives different than the ones that they thought were.
Well, everyone in that room has an interest of their house to go up, and disagreeing with that basic format does not mean better housing values.
So let me reel this back all the way, because for me, this is something that must have been going on for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years now. As a species, as humanity, this is not new to us. We've been warring and fighting and politicking over different city-states for the longest time. And Rhino is a great example, I think, because it doesn't technically exist as like a physical plot of land, right? They came together as an art district, which encompasses 4 or 5 neighborhoods, and sort of like, not say took over, but they have probably more power than any of those individual neighborhoods combined.
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of that was the branding. Like, everyone was like, wow, Rhino is getting a lot of attention. I sit right next to Rhino. I'm just going to call myself Rhino. We did. That's what we did.
Yeah.
We actually, that was what we were, they called Exto Event Center Exto to be extended downtown. They were trying to badge the neighborhood, and they just didn't win the, like, badging war. But they don't care. They're like, whatever, dude, call it Rhino. We're good. It's awesome. It's popular. Let's do this.
That's part of it, right? That's part of the real estate. That's part of the development ploy. Is let's disassociate areas in space from what their past was. Let's erase, because that's what it is. It's really cultural erasure. Yeah. Let's erase what this place is known as and give it a cutesy abbreviated name like they do everywhere else.
Sopa.
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Like, what the hell is a rhino? Like, I get it. Like, I get what it means. I get what the abbreviation is. But it's this cutesy way of redefining something. And in redefining something, you're erasing something else.
You're erasing what came before.
So whether it's Soho, whether it's Low High, whether it's Rhino, it's all about marketing and branding. And so it's a disassociation from what used to be there in order to make it look dressy and sexy for the new
I imagine that's got to be what it was, not to take any shots at any particular institutions or religions, but I imagine that's got to be part of what religion was, right? When we were warring for various giant plots of land across the earth, it was the same kind of crusading for branding, a way for people to identify with it as something as what it's not currently. I wonder what 5 Points is going to become. Are they going to come up with a really cutesy name for 5 Points?
No, they'll stick with the branding. It's a thing. Yeah. Besides, you had your white girl... where's 5 Points thing? Like, that tells you right there.
Yeah, I guess
the zeitgeist is locked
enough.
on it still.
Yeah, it's very interesting, like I said, for me, because it's just, this must be a human issue. It's not an economic issue. I mean, it is maybe also an economic issue and all these other issues, social issues and whatnot, but ultimately, there's something human that hasn't been addressed properly for us to be stomping all over each other like this.
Well, I was thinking, you just made me think, because I've been thinking the whole time, like, well, it's a culture of money and buy low, sell high, those are like, and the gentrification, the levels, like levels exist in money, and that is being echoed in society because that's how money works. But he also just reminded me that, like, it's a culture of new. Like, new is highly rewarded, and it's a highly cultivated meme in society because new makes money. You know? So
whereas
you turn on
old
the TV,
is something you get rid of.
But we also have, like, kind of a natural progression there because it is the future. We're all we're a couple years behind on jetpacks, but we're expecting new technologies every day and new ways to build a house, although we've not really latched onto that. But
I think the interesting thing about that is that there are plenty of folks, I would say, the wisest people I've ever met looked in the opposite direction. Not for what was new and what was ahead, but what wisdom existed long ago. Because, and that's, I think, a secret and maybe like a spiritual hint at where it is we're supposed to be heading as beings of consciousness on this planet, that there is so much to learn from our past. And if we're always forward-thinking, always forward-oriented, we're forgetting all the lessons and mistakes that we've made, and we can't learn from them because we're too busy forging ahead, making new mistakes, and then forgetting those and not learning from them again. So it's a curious thing for me for it even to be mentioned like that. And now I'm realizing why money as a culture could never value the old in that way. It could never value the stagnant, the stuff, the done.
I don't agree that that's it's not impossible.
No, but it's just not the main narrative now.
We have a money culture of limited access. You basically have to pay for your access to money. That's how money works in this situation.
Yeah,
so
that is.
The more
it's
money
weird.
you have, the more money you can have access to, and the cheaper it is to buy it. So, perfectly good example, my uncle was like, he was going to buy a house, and he has the money. He's done oil his whole life, so he's got money. And he was like, well, should I go to the bank and get a loan, which will be very nice, like 3-4%, fixed, because I already have money, or should I get my 20% out of the stock market and just get a loan from the bank at 3%, therefore that particular house investment is making 18% rather than losing 4%. You know, like he can go to someone and get money. And
I'm not smart enough to understand that.
So he could loan his house out at 3 or 4%, you know, but he has the money. Yeah. But if he takes the money that he would spend on the house and puts it into the stock market, he'll get his 15 to 20%, which he has learned how to do.
It's a game.
Yeah.
It's a very strange game to me.
It's cheaper for him to get a loan
than to just buy it outright.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also values. You know, like there's a conflict of values, right? So in this world we live in this country we live in, people have the right to own property, and people have the right to do with their property as they wish, right?
Life, liberty, and property.
To a certain
the
extent.
three things guaranteed to you in the Constitution.
Right. So I mean, it's complicated because we talk about what a more just society looks like in a society that's designed to be individualistic and sort of anything but sharing culture. Right.
So that's for me why I have to personally approach it from the other direction. I'm not so interested in developing a new society that's more just.
Sure.
I think maybe if we focus on being more just humans, more just individuals, or more just communities, then hopefully the society will reflect that. Because that's currently what it's reflecting, right? Mm-hmm. It must be that if what we're getting as from the machine is this individualistic, consumeristic, sort of conquistador society, it must be because a lot of us feel that way as individuals, and that's what we're asking for. And so that's what it gives us. It's basic supply and demand on a sort of spiritual level. So my question to you, Bobby, because this is where I think art is important, is how do you think you convince people? Like, this sounds really stupid, but how do you convince people not to be individualistic? How do you convince them that kindness and community are important?
I don't know if you can ever convince them, but I think that you can provide, an alternative narrative to them to at least ponder. You can provide a viewpoint that maybe they're not familiar with in a way that, we can argue all day. We can fight. We can, sling mud. We can call each other names. Ultimately, that stuff doesn't work. And to be honest with you, I'm not really interested in trying to change anybody's mind.
Gotcha.
That's not my work. It's if you're, dead set in your ways and you're just insensitive and don't really care to be a good person. At some point, that'll come back to you, and you'll have to negotiate that. I'm more interested in elevating the voice of people that I'm close to, of an experience that I've had. And then if that resonates with people, if that sparks something within them that makes them think about something different, that's a win, of course.
Yeah.
But really, I use art as a tool of, provocation and social dialogue. And hopefully that, sometimes leads to social change.
Yeah. Well, I think part of what you just mentioned is a hint that maybe the natural progression of human evolution will lead that way. Mm-hmm. That the meaner spirited you are and the more greedy you are, that in a way, whether or not you believe it spiritually in a woo-woo way or just physics, right, that it will come back to you, or just in the way that interpersonally people will be like, that guy's kind of mean. I don't know if I want to deal with him.
Yeah.
Hopefully, first off, do you think we're trending that direction? Do you think humans are becoming more interested in community and kindness, or do you think it's going the opposite way? I'm just curious on your own feeling.
I don't know, man. I mean, I think, if we look at, globally, or if we look at,
nationally,
more micro here in the city or I think with who our president is right now, it says a whole lot about where we are as a nation, as a collective. I think sometimes, especially us who are more progressive or, have more of a radical agenda, it's interesting to watch this new political landscape unfold in front of us.
Yeah. Nothing like this has happened on this scale. We've had in a way, the Republican Party's always been a representative of it, but it's what makes Trump different than Nixon or Reagan?
It's the same thing. I think that the fear is increasing, though, with those folks that feel like they're losing power, as people of color and women and other marginalized groups are, gaining more traction in government and their voices becoming a little bit louder. That scares the shit out of people who have traditionally held those positions. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that there's this sort of last ditch attempt to try to hold on to that, that past that allowed them to maintain that status quo. And I think that there's, a very visceral reaction to, the feeling that, that is going away, which I think is, hopefully the case. And we just have to keep pushing as people that are invested in, social justice and equity issues. We use that as a platform to continue our individual work and collective struggles, and eventually things will be better.
I think so, but I've got no proof.
Yeah.
Can I, actually, on a super good tie-in there with gentrification, and a personal anecdote as well, is having a yoga studio move in underneath me. Because I was at the corner of Larimer and Downing for the last 5 years, and when I moved there, it was a ghost town still. Like, you had to walk 20 blocks to the Matchbox to even find a business, like down Larimer. And now Larimer is just like hipster central. So, but anyway, the yoga studio creates an interesting situation because it's a very popular hipster gentrification kind of phenomenon coming in with your Whole Foods and everything else. But it does have a backdoor, like a secret little backdoor to the woo-woo, and so where previously these gentrification movements would have been, like I'm questioning, like, maybe is that backdoor, do we see potential there, like, even though it kind of has this surface like yoga girl YouTube channel kind of like very
Well, I would say that's
superficial
kind of yoga, but there still is that backdoor.
Well, I would say that's been very purposefully done. That the reason that yoga is portrayed as like this white, it's first off came from India, so it's like, isn't a white thing. But the fact that it's being portrayed that way, I think, is actually to suppress that power, because a bagel shop does not have that potential, right? The bagel shop doesn't have the potential of reminding people that we're all human, reminding us that we can all breathe and find peace. Now, certain people have more access to that peace based on a variety of factors, but touching it yourself, experiencing that yourself, is something that I think is one of the only ways to bridge people, because you're sort of slapping them in the face with empathy and saying, look, everyone can feel this. You can't assume that people aren't human in the way that you're experiencing this. When you eat a bagel, you don't think that, like, everybody could enjoy this cream cheese in the same way. But the point of yoga is to find unity, right? That's what the word is supposed to mean, union. So I'm a big yoga head, but I don't go to studios, which is actually kind of interesting for that exact reason, which is that I find some people that are really tapped into it and love that stuff and see everybody as ultimately the same, but I'm not sure that is being digested by the majority of folks, but still more so than, like I said, a bagel shop or a coffee shop or whatever the other thing, Cervantes.
Yeah, I think cultural consumption without the willingness to genuinely engage with that culture is a recipe for madness and disaster.
That's what we call appropriation, right?
Right, it's appropriation, right.
But was there any hope for the soccer moms previous to yoga?
I don't want to say is hope or isn't hope. I would say that there's a wider potential path for folks to experience this union, to experience that connection. But, good, bad, right, wrong is all sort of questionable once you enter that world, because you can use a toaster to kill somebody or make toast. So like that's where like I get back down to, it's not about the bike lane. It's not about the coffee shop. It's not about the yoga. It's about why we're partaking in these things. For me, it all comes down to intention. And that's why money is obviously such an issue, because millions of dollars can do great good, but why or how you use it has everything to do with how it actually ends up. Yeah. Well, that's a giant microcosm. Let's take a step back from all the big systemic stuff. Thank you guys for jumping in that with me. And let's just look at Denver as an overall artistic landscape, because it seems like this conversation is something that's coming up more in different art forms across the city. Down in the Santa Fe Art District at the CVA right now, this is a plug, they're about to have a big show on water rights and how access to clean water has historically been something that's separated communities from well-off and marginalized. There is there was a show at the MCA called Failure Lab that I went and saw a little bit of, that a previous guest, Nancy Daro, talked about. That was all about the human experience and about how someone who's living a really oppressed life and someone who's living a really well-off life both experience a paper cut and both experience awkwardness and fear and all those kinds of things. So it does seem like, for me, art is a portal to this common human experience. Do you guys think that that's picking up in terms of its frequency? And do you think Denver is eventually going to really take hold of that, or are we going to go in the opposite direction?
I mean, I absolutely believe that art is, when you boil it down, art is a very primal expression that connects people, right? Mm-hmm. Art is a communication tool. And in our city right now, we live in a city that is, really, really doing really well. There's a lot of artists that are, doing well.
Making a living.
Mm-hmm. A good living. There are also artists that are being displaced by this whole process, and the creative landscape is only going to be as good as the infrastructure that holds it, right? Mm-hmm. And so if we want the soul of our city, which was shaped in part by our artists, by our creative community, this stuff is also sort of, you can't separate the conversation. Yeah. And what's happening right now is the city is booming in a way in which art, just like real estate, is being used as a marketing tool. So we look at Rhino, right? You look at a place where I remember going to, Revoluciones and art shows and places in that neighborhood before it was what it is now. And we were doing the work then. There was artists that were working and exploring and doing really cool stuff. And that bred this culture of creativity that we live in. And now when you don't have the ability to live in the place that you create, in the place that you help build, it's tough. Ultimately, yes, I think artists do deserve more. We deserve to be paid. We deserve to be able to make a good living. We deserve to live in the city that we help shape. And ultimately, art can be a connector. I believe that art is a connector for us.
You can see it obviously going a little past that scale too, though, right? That as there's like, first we want artists to be able to make a living off this at all, which as like an event producer, that's a big gripe I have, because event venues will pay artists, whole artist sets, $200, $300, maybe $400, maybe if you're really lucky, $400 a set, which if you bust your balls, can't make a living off that.
Right.
But simultaneously, if you go too far down that margin, right, and everyone, let's say, in my world, was getting paid $2,000 a set, the kind of people that you'd end up paying, the kind of people that would end up paying them probably wouldn't produce the same kind of cultural artists. They would be passed over. So it's weird that there's this sort of perfect Tao that I think we're all trying to find in art. And I think that I hope that Denver is going to be that for all of America.
Well, and the city's doing really cool stuff at the government level too. Like it's always a delicate dance between what how artists function and how we are supported or not by our city. I think we have some people that hold city positions that are really interested in making our city more equitable. And
any individuals you want to shout out?
I co-chair the Denver Commission on Cultural Affairs, which is the city's
I did not know that.
Yeah, so I co-chair the city's art and culture board. We're responsible for looking after the public art project. We sort of serve as stewards to the mayor for arts and culture. We are responsible for implementing the city's cultural plan. So if people don't know, there's a cultural plan, Imagine 2020, that sort of outlines the creative landscape in the sort of goals for the creative community.
Yeah. Imagine 2020 is a couple of different pieces, right?
Yeah, there's a cultural plan. There are funds and monies available to artists and community groups and things like that. Programs like PSU Are Here, the Imagine 2020 Fund. And so, right now we've been in conversations. So talking about displacement in Rhino, when we're talking about places like Rhinoceropolis and Glob and artists being displaced, our city's really put forward a really progressive plan to help work with artists and property owners in the city to keep artists in place and work on any issues in buildings that aren't up to code. So there's a lot of progressive work that the city's doing to work with artists.
Yeah.
And I think recently there's been a more robust conversation about that. And I think part of that, though, is artists are starting to organize. For a long time, artists are making art. That's what artists do, right? But now in these sort of economic and cultural situations, artists are also having to learn how to be activists, and artists are learning how to be advocates for the arts. Artists are learning about policy and zoning and all these things that are natural killers of creativity in some ways, right?
Because they have to play in that game.
Right. And so now that we have more of this movement where artists are also becoming more savvy with the way that things work, because you have to when you're learning policy so that you can figure out how to engage in conversation
or fund a project or
about that. It's important. So there's a lot of good conversation happening right now.
Yeah. So if somebody was, because I've talked to a lot of folks who are community members, let's say in Five Points or in Curtis Park, and are tired of getting real estate agents who knock at their door every day and ask to buy their home or give them a letter, and they say, "Oh, well, the system's broken. We don't want to participate." What would you say to them, and how would you advise them to go about getting their voice heard through the system?
There's always going to be a certain percentage of artists or people who don't want to engage with the way the structure is set up, and that's cool. I think we need that. I think we need people to continue to live outside and be, completely outside the system. I'm totally in favor of that. I think, though, that I think there's an understanding that if you choose that lifestyle, if you choose that, you're going to be there, and you have to be okay with conditions not changing and being sort of stuck in those very, in those ways, right? But I would also suggest that people get involved with learning more about the way that things operate, showing up to meetings. There's a couple of groups right now. Amplify Arts Denver is doing a lot of good work with the DIY community. They're bringing artists and creatives together and talking about, what it means to engage with the city in conversations about zoning and what does it mean when, whatever, So I think it's important to engage with the structure, because until that structure changes, that's going to be the way that things are done.
Well, the main argument I hear on the other side from folks who hold those kinds of meetings say, well, we have a lot of anger from the community, so we open up this community meeting and no one shows up, is that I think there is a desire from within the system to be more inclusive. It's not a very powerful desire, but it is there, and there are other individuals like you, perhaps, who are opening various doors for folks to be able to step in and really learn how this thing works. Because it's not, even if you just look at statistically across America, right? Like, our demographics are changing. We're always getting younger. We're diversifying what ethnicities and races we are. Our genders are no longer binary. So there are all these new spaces for advocacy and for interest and culture that the city, maybe not the city, that general systems want to open up support for. But folks are still a little bit tender-footed. So you're saying it's okay that some people are that way. It's okay that some people jump all the way in, and it's okay to have people somewhere in the middle.
Absolutely.
Gotta work on every level.
I think that we need that, because we still need the fire and the energy of the people who don't give a shit about participating in government or whatever, because the stuff that they're creating is just as interesting and valuable. And when you have people in positions that understand all of those things, you have a more sort of robust look at the entire cultural landscape. I'm really comfortable in those spaces, complete underground, spaces. And I'm also, hired to do a lot of stuff that is on the other end of that spectrum. So I always tiptoe anywhere in any direction that I go in, and I'm comfortable in those spaces. So I think it does take leadership, though, and you're right. When leadership is diversified, right? So when the city of Denver says, hey, Bobby, do you want to be the co-chair of the Denver Commission on Cultural Affairs? I look at that as progress, because I'm like, these folks know who I am and what I represent, and they're wanting that voice to lead their table. Yeah. So I was a little, shocked when they offered that to me. I was on the board a year. But I also think it's indicative of their genuine interest to engage with people in a new way. Yeah. And so I took the opportunity as someone who believes in leadership, and I believe that I can, bridge communities where I have the ability to, or engage new people in conversation that have been left off the table, Right. And so that's what I really try to do. One of the tenets of the cultural plan is dealing with accessibility and inclusion, right? It's also talking about developing local talent, right? As our city grows, we have to realize that we have immeasurable talent in our city, and so just because we're growing doesn't necessarily mean that we have to outsource talent to come in here. So if we're going to build, if we're going to build something new, why don't we tap into what we have as opposed to bring people in from out of town, right? Yeah. So. That's kind of where I'm at with that.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and I think it makes a lot of sense to the city too. I think they're excited to do that, and excited for folks to step forward and say, this is what our city could be, and this is what I think our city is, or this is who our culture or community is. What I think is interesting is that Denver is physically and literally surrounded by it, right? On the north, you've got 5 Points. To the west, you got the north side and all of what was the Chicano movement and a large Latino neighborhood. To the east, you've got Aurora and the refugee community. To the south, you've got Santa Fe and the arts district down there. So I see this weird amalgamation of stuff swirling around the city, but for me, I'm still very confused as to what the center is. What is downtown Denver's culture? Yeah. Because that's becoming less and less clear to me. It seems like a culture of money, but it doesn't have, in my opinion, a sense of who it is in the way that every other community surrounding it does.
Oh, yeah. Totally agree with that. Especially we've doing Meet in the Street, big up. We haven't shouted that out yet, but I've never been attracted to downtown 16th Street and all that stuff. I always just felt like really
it's not attractive
and stuff. Yeah. And, the street people, in a way, you have that kind of like, oh, it's a little detracting, but I'm also like, this is literally the most interesting thing down here.
Yeah. Is all the weird, cool characters who are driving around in wheelchairs and saying funny things with funny signs.
Yeah. So, but otherwise, it has no real identity. It's amalgam of weird stuff. Like, I don't know, Meet in the Street has a pretty good feel to it. It's nice to have like the activation there, I think, like a little bit more people-based activation. Because otherwise I could just imagine like being a teenager being like, hey, let's go walk down 16th Street Mall, and the entire time's like fast food or candy, like what do we do?
Yeah. Let's go into Payless shoes.
It doesn't engage you on any real level other than like just kind of commercial. And even as a commercial, it's not like, number one, it's like pretty tough to park. So if you're going to do some real shopping, you got to figure out some way to get all of the stuff you just bought back to your car.
2 hours.
Yeah. So like, and then even on that level, if you go down there, you're like, okay, I'm going to get everything on my list, except I can't get any of these things.
Yeah. And part of the reason it may not be attractive to us is because I think it's very visitor centric, right? You've got the convention center,
touristy.
You've got the corny Western shops that sell fake ass native headdresses.
Yeah, that's rough.
Like some of that, that stuff.
It's become so clear. It's trying to emulate all the things around it.
Yeah. It's like a carbon copy of like the real thing, right?
Yeah.
And so those of us who are from here, we're like, oh, if I want to go and buy something indigenous, I'll go to a place that sells something indigenous, hopefully by indigenous people. Yeah. So it's that sort of that McDonaldization of Denver, right? So it's just mass produced and corny and just sort of what you're going to get. But there's a lot of hotels downtown. The convention center's there. It's a pedestrian friendly place where visitors think is cool, and that may be part of it too.
But what they're getting is in Denver, and so they must not think it's that cool. It must seem like every other visitor central place with McDonald's, Arby's, and Taco Bell and Payless shoes that they've ever been.
Or they leave thinking that's what is Denver, which is even more of a disservice. Right?
So that's where I think the city has a genuine vest in including other communities because, and this is, I'm going to reel it all the way back here and someone might get offended. I'm sorry. But ultimately, I think that's a reflection on white culture because white is not an ethnicity. White is not a culture in the way that, let's say, even German is a culture, or Polish, or...
It kind of is, but we say that from the perspective of, like, we don't have an accent. I don't have an accent.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily the accent thing. I think it's...
But white is a culture. It just... It has... Its roots aren't very deep.
Well, they are deep. I think here's the problem. White people have been duped into believing that they don't come from somewhere because white privilege and the idea of blending into what it means to be American. Because let's be real, when we say we're American, we're talking about white culture.
Yeah, we're talking about assimilation.
So white people have been, this is one of the most, I think is the most sad disservice that white people have undergone is the assimilation into American culture.
Right.
Because every white person here comes from somewhere. Their roots are in some other country somewhere else.
Yeah.
So if it's German or if they're from, their people are from Ireland or wherever it may be, they had language, cultural history, they had traditions and customs that
Rituals.
they gave up through assimilation, maybe force sometimes, right? Just like everyone else. But it's easier to blend into this powerful white identity than to reclaim your individual identities because this thing that we've created benefits the hell out of you, right?
Which is what I was saying. Just different, I have shallow roots in that regard. I know basically where I'm from, but very little of that, has leaked through that, barrier at the Statue of Liberty. So.
Well, I can tell you I experience it. And when I say white culture, I guess you're right. I mean American culture.
Sure.
Because I'm relearning a lot of what it means to be Chinese. I'm half Chinese and sort of blown away by how much I love my own culture. There's something that I've heard a bunch now in Native American circles where they talk about how everybody is indigenous. Everyone is indigenous. But there are just those of us who've totally forgotten where we've come from. And it's because of this assimilation. It doesn't mean you have to care about it, right? Like, because I'm Chinese, if I do research into my culture, it doesn't mean I have to do tea ceremony every morning. And, But if I want to, I can. And learning about how my people used to do that gives me a really deep internal reflection as to who I want to be and who I get to choose to be. Without any of that, you just assume that you're some random asshole that was born into this technological world. You're another bit in an endless stream of data. So I think that's part of it, and I think that that's unattractive to people. One of the main things I see folks ask, so I do some work in schools, and when there's a group of kids that come in who are, let's say, Native American, one of the first things I see a lot of kids who are sort of mainstream American culture ask them is like, what rituals did you grow up with? And like, what are the cool things you do that are non-traditional? And it's because they're craving this. They really want something to care about in that way. And I agree with you. It's the greatest disservice that's been moved on. I mean, this just occurred to me right now, but it's so clear how assimilated the culture is when you even just look at fast food, right? The fast food versions are all different cultures, carbon copied into a poor version of themselves. So Taco Bell, a carbon copy of Mexican food, right? McDonald's, I guess, a carbon copy of like German and Germanic and European food. What else? Well, there's other stuff out there, right? I'm not a fast food eating guy, but the point is that
pizza, Italy, kind of
pizza, sure, Italy, right? Yeah. But they're no longer representative of their, you could say, indigenous cultures. They're these carbon copies of a thing left behind long ago.
They're unreasonable facsimiles, copies of copies of copies of copies.
Exactly.
They're grainy,
distilled,
mystic,
and
potential. Visage? I think that's what I'm thinking of.
Well, you told me something the other day, Sampson, about very physically about keys, about how if you copy a key too many times, it doesn't open the door that you're looking to open. And I think that maybe there's a good metaphor there for what people are looking for from culture. I also think it's why, to anybody who loves their culture and is pissed at American assimilation, that's why it should be recognized that really it's not that the people who are doing the oppressing are very oppressed themselves.
Oh, yeah.
And very disconnected. And so there's going to be more and more space to connect each other through these kinds of cultures. Hopefully through the city, hopefully through cultural boards like the ones you work on, hopefully through venues like Exto. But it's up to us to really step forward and say, this is our history, this is our culture, this is what we want to represent.
You know, that gave me an idea of maybe we need to like I want to say recapture, but not recapture, but we need to reinvigorate, re-inhabit the word indigenous, you know, and maybe like we just need to be like, you know, we're saying We Are Denver. What if We Are Denver is an indigenous movement in Denver where we're not like throwing out, you know, all the good, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but, you know, just like I'm pledging to like, what is Denver? I'm compassionate, I'm smart, I'm awoke, whatever you want to say about, you know, in that regard. But like, I'm also like seeking an intimate connection with the world around me, especially Mother Earth, you know, and, but like, I'm indigenous Denver, you know, that's what I'm saying. Like, I certainly am very detached from any like previous history. Like I go back to Nebraska and then I have no idea what happened in Europe. So,
yeah, I think one thing I'm part of this national leadership group called the Intercultural Leadership Institute, and it's bringing arts leaders of color from all over the country together to create sort of a new paradigm of leadership, devoid of white supremacy and white privilege, and where it centers us around indigenous voice. So one thing that we do, and I think a lot of folks do this too, is everywhere we go. So we were in the South for our first cohort in Jackson, Mississippi, and we were, you know, working in the Black community down there, talking about the history that, you know, the Black community has lived through and sort of how that has played into where that community is today. We're headed to Pine Ridge in September, and then we're headed to Hawaii to work with the indigenous Hawaiian communities. And so one thing that we do everywhere we are at is if we have an event, we start by acknowledging the indigenous communities of that land. Right. So one problem I have is when people refer to themselves as natives. Like it's silly, right? In some degrees.
No, it makes sense.
But when somebody says I'm a Colorado native, and I've said it before, I'm a Denver native, right? I've described myself that way. But it also, if we're truly invested in being completely culturally aware and sensitive. I'm not. My people are indigenous to the Southwest, so I do have indigenous roots in this part of the country. But when you have someone saying I'm native to this city, it takes on a different connotation, right?
It glosses over an actual history.
It glosses over, the actual indigenous history of this land. Because
I think that's a little sensitive, just because the word indigenous would exist in that for me. Mm-hmm. Because when I say I'm native of Colorado, I'm just saying I'm born here. I'm not like, again, we come back to like, I don't feel like I have a lot of history to attach to, so saying native of Colorado isn't like...
Well, that goes back to the void that we were discussing before, that's part of the people are seeking this.
Right.
Yeah, it's a weird middle ground. We're running toward the end of our podcast, just so you guys know. So thank you guys so much for being here with The Hour for me. Bobby, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely.
If folks want to find out more about you, more about the movement you were just talking about, more about the Cultural Affairs Board, how do they do that?
Yeah, you can. So I would check out our web series. We have a YouTube channel, Welcome to the North Side. We're on Facebook. We have 5 episodes out. You can find me online, Bobby Lefebre, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And you could Google the Denver Commission on Cultural Affairs to see the work that we do. And we're out in the community. Definitely take a look at the cultural plan, Imagine 2020, if you haven't taken a look at that. And I appreciate the invitation.
Of course. Happy to be here. And I want to also especially thank Sampson, because here in this particular conversation, I want to hold space for all the different voices, that there are so many different perspectives going on here. And one of them is the perspective of whiteness and the perspective of the folks who are just living their lives like they've been doing and haven't had these kinds of conversations. So I think it's really important for us to have both of you on and to have this conversation in a balanced way. So thank you both so much.
Man. Thanks.
Yeah, appreciate you guys. This has been IllFooMinati. My name is Ryan Foo. Find out more about us at www.wearedenver.org and let us learn more about Denver by talking to people like Bobby and people like Sampson. So thank you guys so much, and I hope you guys have a good night. Love and peace.